The wind had a glass edge that morning, sharp enough to shave the breath from a man's lungs. Elias McCrae rode slow across the ridge, his horse moving steady beneath him, hooves sinking into the crusted snow with a hollow sound that echoed against the frozen hills. Late winter had stripped the land to its bones, white plains, gray sky, black trees bowing under the weight of ice. Even the crows had fallen silent, as if the world had decided to rest a while before daring to live again. Elias's coat was old but well cared for, waxed at the shoulders, stitched where time had pulled seams apart. The brim of his hat shadowed eyes that had long forgotten what it meant to look forward to anything. He carried a small leather pouch tied to his saddle, the week's wages for a woman who'd mended his ranch hands' blankets and patched their work coats. He told himself this ride was a matter of fairness, nothing more. The widow deserved her pay. Yet something else, something quieter and harder to name, pressed against his chest as he followed the narrow trail toward her cabin by the frozen creek. The ranch behind him felt emptier each season. Since Hannah's passing, the rooms had grown into hollow chambers that swallowed sound. Her rocking chair still faced the hearth, though the fire there had burned low more often than not. He'd spoken to no one for days except his horse and the wind that rattled the barn doors. There was comfort in silence, but lately even silence had begun to ache. He remembered Hannah's laughter the way one remembers a distant song, half forgotten, impossible to touch. And sometimes when the snow came heavy at night, he thought he heard her humming through the draft. He would close his eyes then as if doing so could bring her nearer. But it never did. Only the quiet deepened. Clara Bellamy's name had surfaced through the ranch hands a month ago. The settler widow east of the creek, they'd said, makes good work with a needle. He'd sent word through Jonah, the stable boy, asking if she might mend what the men had torn. She agreed, though the boy said she'd done it not for profit but to keep busy. Elias had nodded at that. He knew the kind of busy that wasn't about earning but about surviving. As the miles passed beneath him, he noticed a set of small tracks along the frozen path, too light for a deer, too neat for a fox. He leaned forward, studying them. Cat prints, maybe. Then smaller ones weaving beside them. Kittens, he guessed. What creatures could possibly be born into this cold and still hope to live? He almost smiled at the thought, how foolish and stubborn life could be. A curl of smoke finally lifted against the gray horizon. Her cabin. The place was modest, a single-room structure with patched walls and a sagging porch. Snow gathered along the eaves and an old broom leaned by the door, bristles stiff with frost. Elias dismounted, the crunch of his boots startling a bird from the rafters. The animal darted into the woods, leaving only the flutter of wings and the long hush that followed. He stood there a moment, holding the leather pouch, uncertain why his hand wouldn't move to knock. Through the small window he saw her, bent near the hearth, hair unpinned, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She was warming something in a shallow bowl, tilting it carefully toward a box near the fire. Then he noticed movement, a flicker of fur. 1, 2, 3 small kittens, barely old enough to see, pressing against one another for warmth. For a long time he just watched her. There was a stillness to the scene that pressed against the air, as if the world itself held its breath for fear of breaking it. The woman's face was tired, pale from cold and worry, yet her hands moved with astonishing gentleness. She spoke softly, though the words were lost in the crackle of the fire. Finally he lifted his knuckles to the door. The sound echoed too loud in the silence. She turned sharply, eyes wide, then relaxed when she saw him through the glass. She opened the door just enough for the light to spill across the snow. "Mr. McCrae," she said, voice soft but steady. "Didn't expect you in this weather." "Didn't figure it right to wait," he answered. "You done your work?" "I came to settle it." He handed her the pouch. She didn't open it, only nodded once and set it on the table beside a folded scrap of cloth. The kittens stirred, mewing weakly. "They were left out by the creek," she said, her gaze drifting toward them. "Mother gone. Couldn't let him freeze." Elias looked from the animals to her and felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt since before Hannah fell ill. Maybe it was admiration, or maybe it was envy for the tenderness she still possessed. He wanted to speak, to say that she was kind, that the world needed more hands like hers. But his voice caught in his throat. "You'll run out of milk if you keep feeding him," he said instead. Her lips curved faintly. "Then I'll water it down and pray they don't mind." A small silence bloomed between them. The fire popped. One kitten tried to climb the hem of her skirt and tumbled backward into the others. Clara laughed softly, and that sound, light, unguarded, filled the cabin like sunlight breaking through cloud. Elias had forgotten laughter could do that. He shifted, uneasy with how the warmth of it pulled at him. "I best be getting back before dark," he said. She nodded. "Thank you for bringing it yourself." He opened the door, letting the wind sweep in, then paused. "Storm's comin'. You got enough wood?" "I'll manage." He almost offered to bring more but stopped himself. Pity was a poor disguise for care, and he wasn't sure which one he meant to give. Instead, he pulled his hat low and stepped into the white glare of late afternoon. As he mounted his horse, one of the kittens, a gray one with a crooked ear, darted through the open doorway and stumbled into the snow. Clara gasped, hurrying after it, scooping it up before the cold could bite. She looked up at him, then the kitten pressed to her chest, and for a heartbeat he saw something raw in her eyes: fear, exhaustion, and a will that refused to break. Elias met her gaze, the world narrowing to that fragile moment, two souls bound by losses they hadn't asked for. He tipped his hat, meaning it as farewell, though it felt like something else entirely. The wind rose again, carrying the scent of smoke and milk, the faint cry of kittens muffled behind the closing door. He turned his horse toward home, yet as he rode away the sound of her laughter lingered, bright against the silence, like a match struck in the heart of winter. And for the first time in a long while, Elias McCrae found himself wishing the ride home were longer. The next morning dawned pale and shivering, the horizon a thin bruise of light behind gray clouds. Clara Bellamy rose before the fire had found its strength, the cold biting at her ankles through the cracks in the cabin floor. The kittens were huddled close in a basket by the hearth, 3 small knots of breath and fur. She knelt to check their warmth, slipping one trembling finger beneath their bellies. Still alive. That was enough to begin a day. Outside, the snow had hardened overnight, a crust of ice glittering like glass shards. The world seemed made of silence, the kind that pressed on the ears until one could hear their own heart beating. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stirred the embers, coaxing them to rise. As the first orange glow touched the walls, the memory of Elias McCrae standing in her doorway returned with unsettling clarity, the sound of his voice, the way he'd hesitated before leaving, as if he'd forgotten how to say goodbye. It had been months since anyone looked at her without suspicion or pity. When her husband died of fever the previous winter, neighbors brought bread and condolences, then slowly drifted away. Some said a woman living alone was a temptation. Others claimed misfortune followed her like a shadow. Yet the rancher's visit had felt different, quiet, without judgment. She had seen grief in his eyes and recognized it instantly, the way a mirror recognizes light. She poured what was left of the milk into a cup and warmed it for herself, though she gave most of it to the kittens. They were too small to lap without trembling, their mouths clumsy with hunger. Each time one mewed, it struck something deep within her chest, a sound both fragile and defiant. She whispered to them as she fed them, calling them by names she hadn't spoken aloud before: moss, ash, and clover. Names for things that grew despite harsh seasons. The day stretched quiet but not empty. She mended a torn sleeve for Silas Green's store boy, swept the corners and patched the window that whistled with every gust. Her hands moved with the rhythm of survival, small, deliberate tasks meant to keep loneliness from swallowing her whole. Still, every time the wind rattled the door, her heart quickened. She told herself she wasn't waiting for anyone, yet her eyes flicked toward the trail more often than she admitted. By noon, a soft knocking startled her. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it, but when she opened the door, Jonah stood there, the stable boy from McCrae's ranch, his nose red from cold and his boots muddy with thawing snow. "Mr. McCrae sent me," he said, shyly holding out a bundle wrapped in burlap. "Said you might could use this." Inside were split logs and a tin of oats, still warm from his coat. Clara blinked, unable to find words. "Tell him I'm grateful," she managed. The boy grinned, showing a gap between his teeth. "He won't say it, ma'am, but he worries some." When he left, the cabin seemed to hum with quiet warmth. She laid the wood near the hearth and the oats on the shelf, feeling a strange heaviness in her chest, not burden but something gentler. She had learned to survive without expecting kindness. Now, kindness had come knocking and she wasn't sure where to set it down. By late afternoon, the snow began to fall again, soft flakes swirling like ash from an unseen fire. Clara sat near the window, sewing by lamplight, her breath fogging the glass. The kittens stirred in their basket, stretching tiny paws toward the light. She smiled faintly, humming the tune of an old hymn her mother used to sing. That was when she saw him. Elias McCrae rode slowly through the falling snow, his figure half vanished by the white curtain of dusk. He dismounted near her fence, brushing frost from his coat. Something about his stillness made the world around him seem to pause. When he looked up toward the window, she froze, the needle poised midair. He tipped his hat once, a silent greeting, then walked to the door. She opened it before he could knock. "You're back." He nodded. "Brought feed for the horses. Thought I'd check if you needed aught else before the weather turns worse." The wind pushed against his words, curling around them like a living thing. She stepped aside and he entered, careful to stamp the snow from his boots. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, his broad frame, the scent of leather and pine clinging to his coat. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself," she said quietly. "Not trouble," he answered, setting down a sack of feed. "I had to pass this way anyhow." They both knew it was a lie. The McCrae ranch lay 5 miles north. No reason to come through the hollow unless one meant to. Yet she didn't call him on it. Gratitude, when spoken too loudly, could scare a good deed away. He glanced toward the hearth where the kittens were tangled together in sleep. "They're livin'. They are," she said softly. "I think they will make it." He crouched near them, studying their small forms. "Didn't reckon on seeing you tend in to strays." She smiled faintly. "I suppose they remind me that life's still stubborn, even in the cold." He met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them, a shared understanding that neither would dare name. The firelight caught the lines in his face, revealing where they came not from years but from loss. She wanted to ask about his wife but feared the cruelty of curiosity. Instead, she poured tea, the steam rising between them like a fragile truce. As they drank, the silence filled with small sounds, the hiss of logs, the purr of kittens, the distant sigh of wind through pines. He spoke first, voice low. "When Hannah passed, I near let the ranch go to ruin. Couldn't see a reason to keep it." Clara's heart stirred. "And now?" He looked toward the window where the snow thickened into lace. "Now I reckon reasons change." Neither spoke after that. She understood what he didn't say, that the ache of loss could turn a man hollow, but sometimes, even without wanting to, something small could begin to grow again. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door. The air outside had gone white, the road vanishing into fog. He hesitated, hand on the latch. "If the storm worsens, I'll ride by again. Just to be sure you're safe." "I've weathered worse," she said, though her voice wavered. "I know." He smiled, a rare, fleeting thing that softened the sharpness in him. Then he stepped into the snow, disappearing slowly into the dim light, until only the echo of his horse's hooves remained. Clara lingered at the doorway long after he was gone. The wind brushed her cheek like a whisper, and for a moment she thought she heard laughter, hers perhaps from another life. When she closed the door and turned back to the hearth, she saw the smallest kitten, Clover, clambering weakly toward the edge of the basket. It mewed once, a fragile cry that pierced the hush. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the hills, strange for winter, low and distant. She watched the firelight flicker across the window pane and felt an unfamiliar tremor run through her chest, as though the air itself had shifted. Something was coming. She didn't yet know what, but the warmth she'd felt that night was already fighting its way toward something larger, something that could change both their lives forever. By the end of that week, the storm Elias had warned of finally came. It arrived like a slow grief, silent at first, then swallowing the world one flake at a time until the land disappeared beneath a white hush. The wind moved through the valley like a living spirit, rattling the shutters of Clara's cabin and bending the pines into prayer. She'd stacked the firewood Jonah brought in neat rows near the hearth, but the cold still crept in through the walls, thin as breath. For 3 days she saw no one. Only the kittens kept her company, now strong enough to tumble about the floor, their mischief a fragile light in the loneliness. She had begun to hum again while she worked, soft melodies that rose with the crackle of the fire. But each evening, when dusk pressed its weight against the windows, she found herself looking toward the trail where Elias had last disappeared. There was something about the quiet he left behind, something that stirred a longing she didn't trust. On the 4th day the weather broke. The air softened, heavy with the scent of thawing pine. She pulled on her boots and stepped outside, the snow blinding under the pale sun. The world glittered like a field of diamonds, and yet the silence of it felt almost holy. She filled her bucket at the half-frozen creek and looked up to see a column of smoke rising faintly from the ridge. Elias's ranch lay beyond it. She wondered if he too was staring out over the whiteness, thinking of her as she thought of him. The thought frightened her with its sweetness. By the time she returned inside, her hands were raw with cold. She set the bucket down and stirred the fire, but before she could settle, hoofbeats sounded faintly from beyond the ridge. Her heart stuttered. She told herself it was a passing rider, someone bound for town. But as the sound grew clearer, steady and unhurried, she knew that rhythm, It was the same deliberate gait that had carried Elias to her door before. When the knock came, she opened the door with a nervous smile that vanished almost instantly. It wasn't Elias standing there. It was Silas Green, the storekeeper. His eyes held the dry gleam of someone who'd been too long without kindness and too familiar with talk. Behind him stood Mrs. Dunford, her shawl pulled tight around her broad shoulders, her mouth pursed in the shape of judgment. "Afternoon, Mrs. Bellamy," Silas said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "We heard you had company of late. Thought we'd see if you were well." Clara felt the sting before the words even finished. "Company?" Mrs. Dunford's eyes flicked over the cabin, pausing at the kittens, the bread cooling on the table, the second mug by the hearth. "Word travels, dear. Folks say the widower McCrae's been callin' regular." Clara's fingers tightened around the doorframe. "He's been kind, nothing more." Silas chuckled without warmth. "Kindness has its price. Best be careful folks don't mistake it for courtship. A woman alone draws the wrong kind of eyes." Their voices filled the small space with a cold that the fire couldn't fight. Clara felt her dignity thinning, each word scraping at the fragile peace she'd built. "You've no right," she whispered. "Neither of you." Mrs. Dunford sighed. "We mean no harm, child. Only looking out for your reputation. You know how men talk." "I know," Clara said, and shut the door before they could say another word. Their footsteps faded into the snow, but shame lingered like smoke. She sank into the chair, pressing her hands to her face. The warmth of the fire touched her skin, but she felt only the chill of humiliation. The kittens climbed onto her lap, mewing softly as if to remind her that some small things in this world still trusted her. That evening, as the sky bruised into purple, Elias rode through the hollow. He saw two sets of tracks leading away from Clara's door, boots and heavier shoes. When she opened the door to him, her eyes were swollen, her composure frayed. He knew before she spoke that someone had hurt her. "I heard talk in town," he said quietly. "Did they come here?" She turned away. "It doesn't matter. I've grown used to people twisting kindness into something dirty." He stepped inside, snow melting off his coat. "It matters to me." She shook her head. "You'll only make it worse if you defend me. They'll think." "They can think what they want," he said. His tone was steady but low, like a river deep beneath ice. The silence stretched between them. Then, softer, he added, "I only came to bring feed and check on you. The rest, well, I reckon I needed a reason." She looked up at him then, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Why me, Elias? Why risk your name for a woman who has nothing left to offer?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you look after things no one else would bother, Savon. Because you remind me that grief don't have to be the end of love." Something inside her trembled. The kittens stirred at her feet, and for a moment neither moved nor breathed. Outside, the wind began to rise again, whispering through the chimney like a warning. Elias glanced toward the window. "You're nearly out of wood," he said. "I'll fetch more from the shed." She reached for his sleeve before he could turn. "Elias," she whispered, "you don't have to keep rescuing me." He met her gaze, the faintest smile breaking through the somber line of his mouth. "Maybe I ain't rescuing you. Maybe I'm just trying not to lose myself again." He stepped into the storm, the door closing behind him with a thud that felt too final. Clara stood motionless, her heart beating in strange sync with the howl of the wind. She stirred the fire, watching sparks leap like frightened birds. The kittens crawled closer for warmth, their tiny bodies trembling against her palm. Then, faintly through the crack of the door came the sound of splintering wood, a sharp crack, followed by silence. Her chest tightened. She grabbed her shawl and rushed outside. The snow had turned fierce again, swirling like smoke. Near the shed, Elias struggled beneath a fallen beam, the wind having torn half the roof away. His horse reared, spooked by the noise. Clara ran toward him, boots sinking deep into the drift. "Elias!" she cried, gripping the beam with both hands. Together they heaved until it rolled aside. He coughed, brushing snow from his hair, his breath coming hard. For a moment they simply stared at one another, two figures framed by stormlight and ruin. "Should have stayed inside," he said hoarsely. "I told you," she whispered, trembling, "you don't have to keep rescuing me." He smiled faintly despite the blood at his temple. "Then stop giving me reasons to try." The words hung between them, raw and real, carried away by the wind before either could take them back. Clara helped him inside, her hands shaking as she pressed a cloth to his wound. The firelight flickered across his face, softer now, human and breakable. As he closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under, Clara felt the world shift again, subtle, undeniable. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure where her grief ended and something like hope began. Outside, the wind raged on, but inside, the warmth between them had taken hold. And as the night deepened, she understood. Storms might pass, but some hearts, once woken, did not return to sleep. By morning, the storm had spent itself, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening with new frost. The cabin's roof creaked beneath the thawing snow, and pale light slipped through the window pane, touching the room like a blessing that didn't quite dare to stay. Elias McCrae stirred in the chair beside the hearth, the faint scent of smoke and pine rising around him. Clara had dozed on the floor near the kitten's basket, her shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. For a moment he didn't move. He simply watched her, how her hair had fallen across her cheek, how her hand still rested protectively near the kitten's. Something inside him tightened with a strange kind of peace and pain. It had been so long since he'd woken to the presence of another soul breathing quietly in the same space. So long since the silence of a room had felt like safety rather than loss. The fire murmured low, and he rose stiffly, wincing as the bruise at his temple throbbed. She stirred at the sound, blinking against the light. "You're up," she said softly, her voice rough from sleep. "Didn't mean to wake you." She shook her head. "I was half awake. Kept listening for the wind, afraid it'd come back." He poured water into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Looks like the worst passed. You'll have clear skies for a spell." Clara accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his. The contact was fleeting, yet it sparked through him like warmth in frozen veins. "You should rest," she said. "That wound needs tending." "I've had worse." Her brow furrowed. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean you should bear it alone." He almost smiled. "You sound like my wife." The words slipped out before he could stop them. For an instant, the air between them seemed to still. She looked at him with quiet understanding, not pity, and somehow that was worse. "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Hannah." He said it like a prayer he hadn't dared speak aloud in months. She was light. The kind that filled a place even when she wasn't talking. "Lost her to fever last winter." Clara set her mug down, eyes fixed on the fire. "I lost mine to it too, Samuel. It's a cruel thing how the cold takes the living before it takes the land." Neither spoke for a while. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was sacred, the kind that threads two lives together through shared hurt. When the sun climbed higher, Elias went outside to clear the fallen wood from near the shed. Clara followed, her shawl drawn tight against the chill. The world glittered, every branch glazed with light. He shoveled in steady rhythm, his breath rising in pale clouds. "You don't have to help," he told her. "I know." She bent beside him anyway, gathering splinters into her arms. "But I'm tired of being someone people pity. Helping feels better than being helped." He glanced at her, and a quiet smile tugged at the edge of his mouth. "You've got more grit than half the men in town. And yet the town would rather I disappear." "They don't see right," he said. "But I do." The words lingered longer than they should have. She felt the truth in them, felt it settle somewhere deep where cold had long claimed residence. By midday the yard was cleared. They sat on the porch, sharing a meal of leftover bread and tea gone weak. The kittens played near the doorway, tumbling over one another like drops of light. For a brief stretch of time, it almost felt like the world had forgiven them both for surviving. Elias leaned back, studying the open sky. "When the weather warms, I'll be taking a few men south to mend the fences. Could use another set of hands for mending clothes, cooking for the crew. I could pay fair." Clara looked at him, the hint of a frown crossing her brow. "You mean for me to come to your ranch?" He hesitated, sensing the wall rise in her. "Only if you choose it. Thought maybe it'd be easier not to be alone." Her heart fluttered in confusion, half fear, half something far gentler. "People will talk." "They already do," he said. "Might as well give them a story worth their breath." She turned away, pretending to busy herself with the kittens. "You don't know what you're inviting, Elias. A widow with no dowry, no kin, no good name left. People will call it charity. Then let 'em." His tone was calm but unyielding. "I've lived long enough not to answer to gossip." She shook her head, unable to look at him. "And I've lived long enough to know it still hurts." The quiet returned, broken only by the chirp of sparrows and the hiss of snow melting from the roof. Elias reached down, picked up one of the kittens and set it on her knee. "Look at this little fool," he murmured. "Ain't even got sense enough to fear the cold, and yet here it is, alive." She laughed softly despite herself, the sound catching him off guard. "You're comparing me to a kitten?" "I'm comparing both of us," he said. Still here. Still breathin'. Might be reason enough. She wanted to answer, but her throat felt too tight. He stood, dusting snow from his gloves. I'll ride out tomorrow at first light. Think on what I said. She rose too, heart pounding with something that felt too much like loss. If I come, she said quietly, it won't be out of pity or debt. I've had enough of both. He nodded. Wouldn't want it any other way. They stood there, facing one another as the light shifted gold across the field. There was something in his eyes. A promise, perhaps, or simply the raw courage of a man trying to rebuild without knowing how. The kittens darted between them, chasing a speck of sun, and for one unguarded moment, Clara let herself imagine what it might feel like to belong again. That night after he'd gone, she sat by the fire and stared at the pouch of coins he'd first given her. She could leave it untouched, cling to pride and solitude. Or she could trade her fear for something fragile but alive, a chance to build warmth again from what the world had broken. The wind outside had gentled, carrying with it the faintest trace of spring. She stood, crossed the room and opened the door. The moonlight spread over the snow like spilled milk, and in the distance she could see the faint glimmer of Elias's lantern riding the ridge. She pressed her palm to the doorframe, feeling its cool grain beneath her skin. Maybe, she whispered into the night, though there was no one to hear her. Maybe just once more. The kittens mewed behind her, curling close to the fire. She turned back to them, the decision unspoken but already blooming inside her like warmth after long frost. Outside, the sky broke open with the faint cry of a lone coyote, echoing through the valley. It sounded less like morning than a call to something new. And as Clara closed the door, her eyes lifted toward where the lantern light had vanished, knowing that come morning she'd follow it. The next morning arrived silver and still, the kind of dawn that seemed to hold its breath before the first bird dared to sing. Clara rose before the sun touched the window, her mind already decided though her heart hadn't yet caught up. The air smelled of thaw and wood smoke, the slow promise of spring hidden beneath the snow. She dressed quietly, her hands trembling as she tied her shawl. The kittens mewed softly, sensing change, and she knelt to stroke them one last time. Be brave, little ones, she whispered. The world can be kind when it remembers how. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of pearl and lavender. The world looked different now, less like a tomb and more like a waiting room for life to begin again. She packed what little she owned into a small satchel, a mended Bible, her sewing kit, a folded photograph of Samuel, and the pouch of coins Elias had once left on her table. The thought of him brought a warmth she wasn't ready to name. The trail was half melted, the snow giving way beneath her boots with a soft sigh. Her breath came hard, but she walked on, the sound of the creek guiding her north toward the ridge. Above, the clouds opened in thin streaks, sunlight spilling over the hills like a benediction. With every step, her resolve deepened. It wasn't pride that kept her moving, it was hope, stubborn and trembling, refusing to die. When she reached the crest overlooking Elias's ranch, she stopped to catch her breath. Below lay a wide stretch of land bathed in pale gold, fences running like quiet veins across the valley. The barn roof glimmered wet with melt, and smoke curled from the chimney of the ranch house. It looked alive again, less empty, as though it had been waiting too. Elias was in the yard, hitching a wagon. His coat hung open, shirt sleeves rolled, the wind catching at his hair. When he looked up and saw her standing on the rise, he froze as if afraid she might vanish with the mist. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Then he set down the harness and started toward her, boots crunching on frozen ground. You came, he said when he reached her, breath misting between them. I told myself I wouldn't, she murmured. Then I realized I'd been lying. He studied her face as though memorizing it, the determination, the tremor of uncertainty. It's a hard life here, he said softly. Lonely work. Long winters. I know. She glanced past him to the land, the stretch of hills and the distant river glinting beneath the morning sun. But I've lived lonely already. I'd rather spend what's left of it doing something worth the quiet. His expression shifted, something breaking open in his eyes. Relief, maybe gratitude, maybe love, though he didn't dare call it that yet. Then you'll stay? If you'll have me, she said, voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, the sound rough and human, and for a moment, words seemed too small to hold what was rising between them. He stepped closer, his gloved hand brushing hers. The contact felt like confession. I've wanted to ask, he said, since that first night at your cabin. But I thought I'd no right. You've got every right, she said. You've been kind when the world turned its back. That's worth more than vows spoken out of duty. He shook his head slowly. This ain't charity, Clara. Don't mistake it for that. I don't, she said, smiling faintly. It's grace. That's rarer. They stood there, silence woven between their words, until the wind carried a faint creak from the barn. A horse whinnied, breaking the spell. Elias cleared his throat. Come inside. Fire's burnin'. You look half froze. She followed him down the slope, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound. Inside the house, the air was warm, faintly sweet from coffee on the stove. The room bore signs of a man who had once lived and stopped living. Tools neatly arranged, dust gathered in corners, a chair that hadn't been touched in a year. She looked around quietly, her gaze falling on a faded photograph on the mantel. A woman with gentle eyes and a smile that felt like sunlight. That's Hannah, he said, noticing her pause. She'd want this place full again. Not silent like it's been. Clara stepped closer, her voice soft. Then we'll keep it that way. Full. He watched her a long time before nodding, as if something deep inside him had finally found rest. By afternoon, the light turned golden, and the snow began to drip from the eaves in steady rhythm. Together they moved through the house, clearing, sweeping, opening curtains. Laughter came easier than either expected. At one point, when she dropped a pail of water and startled herself, Elias laughed outright, a sound rusty but alive. The kittens, brought in a small basket from her satchel, explored the floor, their tiny paws tapping against the boards. As twilight fell, they stood on the porch side by side, watching the last of the snow melt into the soil. I'll build a pen by the barn, Elias said. Those kittens'll need a place when they're bigger. She smiled, folding her arms. They've already found one. He looked at her then, really looked, and something final shifted in the space between them. The air felt charged like the earth before rain. Slowly he removed his hat and set it on the railing. Clara, he said, voice trembling in a way she'd never heard from him. I don't want you here as my worker. Or guest. I want you here as my wife. Her breath caught. For a moment, all she could hear was the soft trickle of melting snow and the wild hammering of her heart. Elias. He took a step closer. I ain't a man of fine words. But I know what it means to lose everything and still find something worth keepin'. You're that for me. Her eyes burned, tears bright against the fading light. I told myself I'd never marry again. Not after burying one heart already. Then don't marry for sorrow, he said gently. Marry for the living part. The part that still wants to believe in warmth. The wind brushed her face, cool and clean, and she realized the ache she'd carried all this time had begun to soften. Not disappear but change shape, turning into something almost tender. She reached for his hand. If I say yes, she whispered, promise me it'll be a life of kindness, not just survival. That's the only kind I've got left to give. The sky deepened to amber and rose. He drew her close, and the world seemed to narrow to the steady beat of their hearts. The first stars began to flicker as their lips met, soft, uncertain, but full of life. When they finally pulled apart, she leaned against his chest, hearing the low thrum of his voice. Looks like the kittens won't be the only new life here. She laughed, tears mingling with her smile. Guess not. From the barn, a colt neighed, and the sound rolled across the valley like a herald of beginnings. The snow gleamed faintly beneath the moonlight, and the land at last seemed to breathe again. Later, when the fire burned low and the house glowed with quiet warmth, Clara looked toward the window and whispered, We made it through the winter, Elias. He pressed his hand over hers. He murmured. And spring's finally ours. Outside, the kittens curled together by the door, tiny shadows in the lamplight. Above them, the stars burned brighter than they had in years, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting for this. For two weary souls who'd finally stopped surviving and started living.